Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, host and head bookologist here at the Get Literate podcast. I'm a book-loving, notebook-hoarding reader and writer on a mission to change lives one book and one notebook at a time. On this podcast, we explore the power of bookology and leading literate lives. We talk all things books and reading and notebooks and writing, mixed in with mindful practices and creativity to create lives we love. You can expect regular weekly episodes focused on 3 books you need to know about on a bookish theme and how to bring those themes to life in our actual lives too. You can also expect author interviews, notebooking inspiration, and topics to help us grow through what we go through and take inspired action to make our lives better. So grab a notebook and your TBR list and let's get literate. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Get Literate podcast, a podcast where we talk all things books and reading, notebooks and writing to make life better. I'm Stephanie, your host, and today your bookologist, who is here with another collection of books to celebrate the season. And what season might that be? The reading season, of course. If you've been listening to recent podcast episodes, then you know that this month is National Reading Month. You also know that my one-word theme of the month is bibliolatry, that wonderful word that means to celebrate the books we adore and to take the time to pay homage to books. I've been surrounding myself with reading all month long, even more so than I might usually do, because what we pay attention to and what we surround ourselves with grows. You know that quote, where attention goes, energy flows. That's why I love to use books as sparks for what I want to see grow in my life. If I want to be healthier, then I read books about being healthy. If I want to learn how to grow a garden, then I look at gardening books for inspiration, which I do, by the way, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull off. Or if I am a historical buff and I want to learn new facts, well, then I surround myself with books that are nonfiction and interesting and pique my curiosity. The books we choose can open portals into other aspects of our lives. And that goes for our reading lives too. If we surround ourselves with books, and especially if those books are about books, then it will likely spark our reading life even more. And what perfect way, what better way to celebrate National Reading Month than reading books about books? That's what we're doing here today. I have books about books, books about bookstores, books about mobile bookstores, books about libraries, books about librarians, books about writers, and books about bookish people too. Now, I usually like to limit my focus to a deep dive into 3 books. I know as a listener of bookish podcasts myself, anything more than that, and I feel like all of the books get lost in the shuffle. I get overwhelmed by the sheer amount of books the podcaster is talking about, and I usually end up returning to none of them. So that's why here there are typically 3 books that I like to mention. But I'm going to be honest, I cannot help but just briefly mention and sneak in a couple more topics for this episode because it's one of my favorite genre topics to read in, books about books. So get your notebooks ready to jot down some of the titles that are going to come at you, or know that you can head to the show notes at alitlife.com and you can browse the entire list there. So first, before I get into the 3 books that I want to recommend specifically for today, I have to mention these books just in case you haven't read them yet. These are books that I've already talked about on the blog, that I've already shared on the podcast, or if you know me and my social feed, then you know I love these books. So if you haven't read them, be sure to read first And I recommend this one first because I adore it. The Bookshop on the Corner by Jenny Colgan. I love everything Jenny Colgan writes. So when Jenny Colgan writes a book about books, I am all in. This was the first book I read that talked about a mobile bookshop, literally a book in a renovated bus going across the countryside. It is delightful. It is every book lover's dream, I think, to do. And it lets you get lost in a world where all of that is completely possible. So, The Bookshop on the Corner by Jenny Colgan, I have to mention at the top of the episode. The second one is also related to a mobile bookshop, but it's actually a book barge, if you can believe it. The Little Paris Bookshop by Nina George. This is about Purdue, who is a bookshop owner. And he is a bookshop owner because he was inspired by a book that he read. He takes great pride in connecting books to the very exact reader that needs it. But when he realizes his life needs a little something, he ends up traveling lots of places in order to find the author of the book that set him on his bookshop dreams. The book is a wonderful homage to books for sure, but also the journey that books can take us on, right? Because we start with a book and then ideally we end up making our actual life better. Now, the last one, if you haven't read The Reading List by Nisha Adams, please go get it. Please go get it. This is a book about books, and this is a book about people, and this is a book about how those two things connect together. In a local library, a main character finds a reading list, just a simple list of books that someone says, I think you need to read these. And what happens throughout the book is that multiple people find the list, and those people end up connecting together. And at the very end, you figured out who made the list and tucked it into the book in the first place. It's a beautiful celebration about books, about the power that they have to connect us together. And I would say the power of the human spirit too, because all of these characters are dealing with different challenges that books are helping to soothe. Now, those are the three books that I think you must read before I get to the selections today. But I can't help but sneak in two memoirs that I think are must reads for book lovers as well. The first is Anne Bogle's I'd Rather Be Reading. This is a smaller book that you can get through really quickly so that you can go back and reread your favorite parts. Anne Bogle, as we all know, is What Should I Read Next podcaster. And she has a beautiful way of recommending books to others and just living a truly bookish life. This book is a collection of essays that talks about the reading life. She calls it the delights and the dilemmas of the reading life. And the second memoir is from Zibby Owens, the mega publisher, the mega media bookish person who is coming into the limelight. Her memoir is called Bookends, and it's about love, loss, and literature, and how books have been with her, for her, every step of her journey. And those are two memoirs that I think if you are a bookish person, you'll find yourself in those pages and maybe be inspired to do something else that's bookish as a result of reading them. So I know, I've already mentioned 5 books before I have gotten to the 3 I really want to talk about, but I just had to, because those are the books, if someone says to me, I want a book about books, what would you recommend? Those are the 5 that instantly come to mind. But now I am ready to talk about 3 different books. These are books that I have not talked about in depth on the podcast or on my blog at all. These are newer reads for me, quite recent actually, and they are different than any of those books that I have just recommended. So you're going to end up with a nice wide range of bookish books that you could choose from to celebrate bibliolatry and National Reading Month. The first one I want to recommend is an absolute book lover's dream. This book is titled No Two Persons by Erica Bauermeister. Now, I know others who have read this much earlier than I have, and I'm jealous because I am only getting to this book recently. But as I mentioned, this book is truly a book lover's dream. It's an ode to stories. It's an ode to those who write them, to those who publish them, to those that read them, and then finally to those that live them. This is a book that compiles multiple stories of multiple characters and how their lives are threaded together in both visible and invisible ways through a single book. Now, that book all starts with Alice, who is the writer in the first chapter. And she has had a hard childhood, a hard time, and finally wrote her debut novel. It cracked her soul open wide, writing it and putting Theo's story out into the world. But it personally touches in very significant ways each reader who encounters it as well. And the rest of the book, after Alice's first chapter, is about a reader or someone who is very connected to the book and how that book has changed their life. So for each character, the book truly is medicine. For some, it soothes. For some, it creates opportunities. For others, it heals and awakens. So as we explore the different characters' lives and the way the book has made a personal and tremendous impact, we gain insight into the actual book that Alice wrote that started it all. So Theo technically isn't a real published book, but by the end of No Two Persons, you do know what happened to Theo and the way that the story went. And then you can see how it helped transform all of the readers who ended up following in its wake. What I loved is that the connections between characters weren't always very explicit. We move from Alice's chapter to the next chapter of the book agent who finds it. And then the next chapter is the actor who ends up reading the audiobook. And then the chapter after that is a reader. And then the chapter after that is another reader. And so it has this wonderful building up, this wonderful domino effect. And towards the end, you start to see some of those connections between them, but they're like little Easter eggs that you have to find and that just pop up. And you, as the reader, really can make the connections in your head. I absolutely adored this book. And if you love books, I know you will too. I pulled a lot of quotes out of this book, and I do just want to leave you with one or two of them. One of them that we talked about in our Get Literate book club was this: a group of books is called a raft, right? Books can lift us up. Books can buoy us. Books can save us in lots of different ways. And another one I loved: the story isn't done because it goes on to live in the reader's minds in a way that's particular to each of them. And that was Alice thinking about her book being done, but knowing that it wasn't done because the reader was going to use it in whatever way they needed. And that brings me to the last quote. That was the beauty of books, wasn't it? They took you to places you didn't know you needed to go. And this book allows you to go to so many places, all connected with this single book that started it all. I think you can probably tell I adored this book. The very first book I read in 2024 was The Book That Mattered Most by Anne Hood. And this one is side by side, neck and neck. It's so good. 2024 has definitely been an excellent start for my reading life. And that actually brings me to the second book that I want to share because Anne Hood, who I just mentioned, wrote this second book. The second book I'm bringing to you is a memoir, but in a collection of essays and in a compilation of books. So, like many readers, I have books that I feel like have impacted the entire trajectory of my life. I can think back to my childhood and remember those books that made a difference, that changed me, that I remember like it was yesterday. The monster at the end of this book, The Babysitter's Club, Judy Blume, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Any number of the Danielle Steele books. We have books that impact who we are. They can help us grow. They can help us learn. They can help us heal. They can soothe us. We can feel seen inside the pages. We can see a new perspective in those pages. And you know what I believe in? Books can help us make our tomorrow better because of what we learn in the pages. Now, Anne Hood's book called Morning Star, Growing Up with Books, is her beautiful chronicle of her own trajectory of books over the course of her life. She talks about the 10 books that taught her 10 lessons. So each chapter is a book that has had a significant impact on her and the way she lives her life. And we get a beautiful picture of what her life was like and how central books were to how that life decided to go. Now, 10 books, 10 lessons. There are a couple of extra books tossed in there for good measure, but that's pretty normal. I'm doing that very thing right now today in this episode. And what I love is that she leans into her favorite titles or her most impactful titles. And in doing so, you just can't help but think about what your 10 books and your 10 lessons would be as well. Now, she's got a lot of great quotes in this book, but this one was one of my favorites. In the library, I was handed a blueprint on how to live my mysterious, unnameable, big dream life I wanted. I was handed books, and through reading them, I grew up to find that very life. And she goes on to say, I believe that magically, the book we are supposed to read somehow appears in our hands at just the right time. And Anne Hood believes, and I would agree, that the books that have impacted her in ways that shaped who she is today. And so this book is a chronicle of those 10 books and those 10 lessons. But more importantly, it's an invitation for you to think about the books that might be in your memoir or collection of essays. I love books that get me thinking. I love books that keep me reading, but I also love books that send me to my notebook. And this one definitely did that as I tried to brainstorm the 10 books that I would include on my lifelong list up until now. So that's Morning Star, Growing Up with Books by Anne Hood. Next up is a book unlike any other book that I have read, and that is pretty much because I don't typically enjoy reading fantasy books. And so if you were to look at my bookish spreadsheet, that is the genre that is typically the most neglected. But this book could change that. This is a delightful book filled with talking cats, fantastical bookish trips, and personal transformation. The book I'm talking about is The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. This is a delightful book for book lovers. It is about Rintaro. And Rintaro's grandfather, who was the beloved owner of Natsuki Books, passed away. And it left him feeling incredibly lost and incredibly alone. Now, in the past, he's always been comforted by books, no matter what he's been going through. But now he must close his grandfather's bookstore that he has loved so much and grown up with, and close the life on the door, or no, close the door on the life that he has been accustomed to. But before he ends up doing that, a talking cat appears. Yes, a talking cat. This is where we go into the fantasy world. And this talking cat invites him on a journey through 4 labyrinths. And in these labyrinths are opportunities to save books from incredibly strange dimensions and set them free. So in one of the labyrinths, there are books that are being imprisoned and kept away so neat and tidy that no one will ever be able to enjoy them. In another labyrinth, there are books that are being reduced to single lines and 1-sentence summaries so that more humans will actually read them. In another labyrinth, books are being shredded, and more bookish dilemmas. So Rintaro and this talking cat head off to each of the labyrinths to save the books. And he's not quite sure how to do it, but he relies on his own love of books, his own bookish personality, and the words of wisdom he remembers from his grandfather to attempt to save these books. Now, I won't give the ending away, but it is delightful. Then the best part is as Rintaro figures out how to save the books in the fantasy world, he just might be figuring out how to save himself in the real one. I loved this book. I wasn't sure about the fantasy element, but the second that talking cat appeared, I was all in. I was completely hooked. And so if you're not typically a fantasy book reader, but you love books about books, I think you should give this one a try. Now, one of my favorite quotes in this book really wraps up my whole philosophy about reading, right? And restorative reading and using reading to make life better. And here it is. It's all very well to read a book, but when you're finished, it's time to set foot in the world, right? We have to take action. But then he also reverses it and says, a book that has been cherished and loved and filled with human thoughts has been endowed with a soul. What a beautiful back and forth. Books breathe life into us, and we breathe life into books. I just adored this book and the message behind it. That's The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. Now, I know that I said I was only deep diving into 3, but I just can't let you go. I can't end this episode without telling you about 2 books that are on my March TBR. So I have 2 books about books that I plan to read, and so I just want to briefly mention them in case maybe you want to grab them too. The first one is a delightful title. It's called The Upstairs Delicatessen on Eating, Reading, Reading about Eating, and Eating while Reading. And if you are a book lover, you can relate to all of those things. So this book is written by Dwight Garner. He is a New York Times critic, and he is, according to the publisher, serving up the intertwined pleasures of books and food. It says he's the product, or the book is the product of a lifetime of obsessively reading, eating, and every combination therein. So this is a book about how reading and food and living are intertwined in this beautiful nonfiction memoir. So that's the Upstairs Delicatessen on eating, reading, reading about eating, and eating while reading. I just love to say that title. The next book, and actually the last one that I will mention today, is titled The Reading Cure: How Books Restored My Appetite. This is another book that intertwines reading and food and culture, but in a very different way. This is the memoir of Laura Freeman, who recovered from anorexia through books. Now, obviously, the recovery had so many more facets than just her reading life, but in her words, she gradually rediscovered how to enjoy food and live a more broad, healthy life through literature. As she read, she was given courage to try new dishes based on the books that she was reading. So things like Virginia Woolf's Bread, Blackberries, and Biscuits, right? She says book by book, meal by meal, Laura developed an appetite and discovered an entire library of reasons to live. I mean, how beautiful. How beautiful of a description that could be. Books have power. Books have so much power to make life better, to make us grow, to make us learn, to make us feel. And this is the perfect collection of books to remind you of the power of them and remind you that you are in a community filled with so many bookish people that are doing the same. So I would love to know what your favorite books about books are. Give me all the titles. Books about bookstores and bookshops, books about mobile bookstores and bookshops, books about libraries, books about authors, books about bookworms. Send them my way. You can head online to the show notes at alitlife.com and drop your titles in the comments. You can find me on social media at AfinitoLit and let me know in the comments of the post for this episode or send me a direct message. You can send me an email at stephanieaffinito@gmail.com, or you can click on that little audio button inside your podcast platform and send me a quick audio message instead. You know, I'm going to collect all these titles and I'm going to add them to my bibliotherapy book list that I have on my website. So if you want even more books that I have mentioned today, you can head to alitlife.com and you can find that post that is always growing. Now, one last thing. This past Sunday in my Get Literate Patreon community, we figured out more reasons to celebrate bibliolatry and reading. I shared a year of literate love. It is a 2024 calendar of bookish celebrations and notebookish celebrations to keep us reading and in the spirit of books about books all year long. So if you are already a Patreon community member, make sure you head to our feed and download your printable PDF. But if you're not a member yet, maybe this printable will be the thing that gets you to head on over and give it a try. You can find out more and download the printable at getliterate.co. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. I hope I have added to your March TBR, and I do hope that you will add to mine. So be sure to send me all of your bookish recommendations and have a wonderful week full of reading and celebrating bibliolatry. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I'll see you inside the next episode. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Get Literate podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. Plus, if you want more, you might like to join my Patreon community. There, you'll find additional inspiration for your reading and writing life, like bonus podcast episodes, bibliotherapy book calendars, monthly book clubs, notebooking challenges, live events, giveaways, and much, much more. It's only $5 a month, and you get instant access to all of the previous content too. You can learn more at getliterate.co. And one more thing, if you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish and notebookish community too. Thanks for listening.